There are probably 100 different stories I could tell you about the crazy things I've seen fighting fires. You might have heard it before, but when you're in the thick of it, with that fire almost laughing in your face as you try to beat it back, I swear to God it's like a living, breathing thing. I've been doing this for the better part of 10 years, but there's nothing that haunts me more than what I witnessed back in that late summer of 2018. It was around the middle of August, and this was looking to be about the worst of so many wildfires we'd fought over that year so far. Back then, I was part of the National Forest Hotshots just outside of Fresno. I mostly work as an EMT these days, but I do still volunteer firefighting on the side, as well as giving some training classes for the new recruits. With my expertise and experience, I couldn't walk away from it entirely, even if this experience damn near caused me to abandon the job completely. I've been 4 stories up into the guts of a burning building crumbling apart beneath my feet. It even helped a kid climb to freedom from a well, as cliche as that is. Curiosity does get the better of many children out there, as well as plenty of adults who should damn well know better by this point in their lives. I can't say that I or anyone else I know on the job has ever had to fish a cat out of a tree before, but that ain't saying it doesn't happen, of course. Still, no matter what I've seen over the decade I've been doing this, there's nothing that will ever compare to this one. Not for me, anyway. It was early afternoon when we were making our way out to the scene, 15 of us in all. We were heading to meet up with the crew who had been out there since the previous night, hoping to relieve them while staying ahead of the blaze. As we wandered on, discussing the finer points of digging ditches and cutting the wild brush and the like, we heard some sort of panicked-sounding voice on the radio. Be it from the fire itself, the weather conditions, or how deep into those woods we were, we could barely make out a word that was being said, but it wasn't hard to tell they were pretty freaked out. Elizabeth Parker, Liz, Lizzie, or simply Parker, to the rest of us, who was one of our newer recruits, tried to place a call on her cell to figure out what was going on. When the thick plume of black smoke began to drift through the trees around us, we didn't need clarification on what was going on. From what I could figure, and according to facts I'd hear sometime long after the sun went down, the fire dramatically shifted direction, heading right for us. That time of day is the most dangerous for a wildfire, when the sun is hot, humidity is low, and the winds are high, making things more than unpredictable. "You ain't always going to be able to outsmart a fire," the chief used to say back when I was green as a cucumber, and he wasn't wrong. As soon as that thick cloud came rolling in, I took a head count. I came up 3 short, ultimately noticing that Parker, Gray, and Jackson were unaccounted for. They were all fairly new to the team, so I had to assume that they had just panicked and fled, but we didn't have any sort of time to hunt them down. We weren't going to outrun this son of a bitch, and we didn't have a snowball's chance of beating it back, so we had only one option left: deploy our fire shelters right here and now. They didn't seem like much, being made of an outer layer of aluminum foil backed with a silica weave that reflects the heat, but they could be ineffective in a pinch, and oh boy were we in a pinch. I tried to keep the trembling in my voice as hidden as possible while I gave a quick run over of the procedures every one of us should know by heart. Unzip the carrying case, pull out the shelter and shake it open. Step into it, pull it over your head, and lie down with your face close to the ground where the air is the cleanest and coolest. Use your elbows, knees, and feet to pin the shelter down to counteract the winds created by the fire, which could potentially reach 60 miles an hour and up. Maybe I was reciting these instructions to combat my own fear at the time, but it seemed to help calm some of the crew as well, or so it looked to me anyway. The air was already thick by the time we all dropped to the ground, huddled up like a veritable subdivision of reflective igloos. If I had to describe it, which, given I've chosen to talk about this, I suppose I do, I would imagine the sensation to feel similar to what a frozen dinner goes through over those first 30 seconds or so in the microwave. I could feel the almost intolerable heat sweep over me, accompanied by the sounds of debris falling from the trees while they showered over us. Though it only lasted minutes, it felt like I was cooped up in that glorified aluminum foil for hours, feeling my skin inflame from the blaze and bruise from the debris. Along with the whooshing sounds as the fire engulfed us, I heard the screams of some of the crew. A couple shouted out that they couldn't take it anymore, inspiring me to practically bark my demands that they do not leave their shelters under any circumstances, knowing full well that if any should break free of their cocoons, their lungs would immediately fill with the burning smoke, quickly putting their lives to a swift and painful end. I could only hope they could hang in there. When the raging inferno finally passed by, I hesitantly pulled my shelter away, scattering soot and chunks of charred wood to the blackened forest floor. Being certain that this was likely only the first wave we had survived, we quickly went to work snuffing out the patch fires we could while attempting to move further away before the next one hit. These shelters could sustain a lot, but I didn't want to put them any further to the test if we could avoid it. Not to mention that I still hoped to be able to locate our missing crew. They panicked, something any of us could be capable of, but I prayed to everything I held holy that they had remembered their training and deployed their shelters before it was too late. As we attempted to stay close together while making our way further out, blackened and dead trees shed limbs and splinters of wood around us, causing us to get more and more separated by the second. I called out to those I hoped not to lose track of to be sure to shelter up before that next wave could move in, and I only heard scattered replies. Within mere moments, I could feel the warm smoke approaching from my rear while darting my eyes around in desperation to make another head count. Somehow, whether I had taken the wrong path or the others had, I found myself alone. The area I was currently running through had miraculously been untouched by that first wave, but I continued shouting out to anyone who may hear me. When only that familiar distant whooshing granted me reply, I hoped the crew had found a good place to deploy before it got to us. I allowed myself a single glance to my back, to seeing the orange glow of the approaching wave a ways off. I knew I had to deploy my shelter soon, but when I noticed a lone cabin some yards ahead of me, I felt panic begin to set in. I pulled the water from my pack, lifting my mask and attempting to clear my throat enough to call into the small wooden cottage while pounding on the door to see if anyone lingered within. For seconds, which felt like hours, I heard nothing but the approaching blaze. I gave a heavy sigh, hoping that the cabin was indeed vacant, deciding I needed to move on and find a good place to deploy. When I made my way around the side of the building, a blood-curdling scream from somewhere inside caused just about every drop of blood in my face to sink to my churning stomach. With that aggravated orange glow from behind growing closer by the second, I had no time to waste, but I couldn't allow anyone trapped inside to be consumed by the inferno. This being far from the first time I've had to take down a door, I made quick work of it, taking only 2 quick swings of my axe to break through. My mask was foggy between the heat causing me to sweat a veritable river, and the smoke already filling the room, but I could tell the screams were coming from below. When I located a door to an apparent basement, I had to break that one down too, as it was held shut with even more locks than the one that led into the house. I could barely fathom why anyone would be concealed in such a manner, but I didn't need to waste any energy focusing on the great many questions that were building up. I finally broke through that door, hearing the shrill screams far louder than before. Between my racing heartbeat and my foggy mask, I damn near tripped down the steep stairs in my haste. When I reached the bottom floor, I could barely believe my eyes when I looked upon the source of the horrifying yells that led me into the old cabin. It took me a moment to recognize her, given the state she was in. But Parker had been stripped naked, strapped to a chair with leather belts around her armed legs and torso, and I can even imagine what sort of person could have carved those intricate symbols and runes into just about every inch of her flesh I could make out. But it was the blood that spewed from her wrists that had my more immediate concern. The gashes looked fresh, but I knew how quickly every last drop of blood could leak from such wounds. I cut the straps to her arms first, as they allowed me the freedom to work on ceasing the blood flow from her wrists. She was covered in blood from head to toe, clearly in shock and weakening more by the second. Not only that, but that whooshing sound from beyond the walls was drawing closer with every moment I spent getting her loose. It wasn't until I was cutting the straps around her shins that I noticed the grooves on the floor, to which the blood from her torn wrist was leaking. Though I knew I had to get us out of there, I couldn't help but trace my eyes across the ground, following where those twin grooves led to a 5-pointed star in the center of the room. It could be nothing more than that orange glow from the slender windows near the ceiling that made the pentagram look as though it was almost shimmering with its own light. But when Parker barked my name, pulling my attention back to the situation at hand, I had to push my curiosity to the side. It didn't take me much longer to get that last strap around her midsection cut, but time was not something we had the luxury of. When I noticed Parker's discarded clothing and gear near the back wall, we both worked quickly to get her in a fit condition to get out of there. She was still in something of a shocked and frenzied mental state, but her instincts were still intact. Even if it was the panic that caused her to run before, I had to give it to her on this one. Most other people would be damn near catatonic if they'd endured what she'd been through, but not Elizabeth Parker. If we survived this, I hoped she would be able to give me some answers to who did this to her, but those would have to wait. The exterior walls were already smoking when we reached the ground floor, with the inferno raging right outside the splayed open front door. We headed for the back, both of us thankful to see the situation not quite as dire to the rear of the building, but we knew that wouldn't last. Though she was still weak from blood loss, she still moved almost as quickly as she could with a full tank. We busted through that back door and gunned it as quickly as we could. I could tell my oxygen was starting to run low, but with the flames right at our asses, that was the least of my concerns. As soon as we saw that riverbank, Liz was already pulling out her shelter, reminding me to do the same. While hers was still fresh, mine had already endured that first wave, but I hoped it could handle another one. Even if I was halfway tempted to just leap into the water, I followed the book and planted my face to the ground in the hopeful safety of my best impression of a TV dinner. Our screams blended into one as the fire embraced our flimsy tombs, while a distant explosion assured me that the cabin likely had some flammables within. I didn't doubt that the small cottage wouldn't survive this, but I had hoped enough would remain to potentially yield some evidence. Perhaps my mind was simply looking for distractions, while my skin began to feel as though it was cooking. Parker still shrieked from beside me, but I could only imagine how badly those flesh wounds covering her slender body were burning at that point. Other than the glorified sunburn I had received from that first wave, I was mostly in one piece, while my crewmate was beaten, bloody, and bordering on bloodless at the time. Still, given what we had endured already, I was truly not expecting us to survive this. Not with how bad it had gotten by the time we escaped that cabin. When a hauntingly deep scream yelled out from somewhere off in the distance, I damn near shit my pants. Something about that horrendous wail sounded both agonized and furious. At first I thought my shelter was failing and the sound was caused by my eardrums melting away. Another thought that crossed my mind after assuring myself that I wasn't a Thanksgiving turkey just yet was that the fire itself screamed out in anger while we held it back with our protective cocoons. Perhaps it had had its fill of wood and stone, and our keeping ourselves concealed was denying it the meal it deserved. Irrational? Yeah, maybe so, but I wasn't feeling particularly rational at the time. Even with the angered whooshing surrounding me, as well as the splitting and cracking of the trees spilling more debris across my fragile shell, I became aware of one more sound that threatened to cause my bladder to give up. Being fully aware of the inferno raging outside my flimsy shelter, I was certain the footsteps I heard approaching could not belong to anything living. With my heart racing so erratically, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than my frenzied pulse beating against the inner wall of my ears. But that didn't explain how it sounded like it was drawing closer by the second. As I felt my shelter wrinkle as though fingers were wrapping around it from the outside, I had no doubt it was failing, and the burning hot fumes would breach my lungs soon. I screamed out harder than I ever had before, even more so when Parker let out another shrill squeal from beside me. Part of me wanted to break free from my confinement in hopes of saving her before the flames consumed me, but I knew there was nothing I could do. Not with how hopeless the situation was looking for both of us. I was barely aware of the sounds of the scooper above, nor the approaching ground crew, but that first blast of water rained down on me. I can't even describe the sensation in a way that would do it any justice. Everything faded into a blur as voices called out from around me while I hesitantly pulled myself free from my shelter. Just about everything I looked upon was blackened and charred, but the faces, both familiar and unfamiliar, around me were one hell of a sight for my reddened and swollen eyes. Though I was still mentally out of it, I managed to get the attention of some of the others on the scene to get Parker some help. By the time I and a few of the other boys got her to safety, the fire had almost been beaten into submission. I stayed with Liz on the ride to the hospital with the recommendation that I get checked out as well, as I had sustained some pretty decent burns over that last hour or so. In all honesty, I can barely believe that all of it occurred over such a short period, but that's the nature of trauma, I suppose. Over the following days, when Parker was up to it, we both had a lot of questions to answer. I couldn't tell them much, given that it was a combination of luck and the fire that led me to the cabin in the middle of nowhere. And unfortunately Parker couldn't offer much either. According to what she could recall, as I had suspected, she took off running the second she saw Gray and Jackson attempting to escape the approaching blaze. Whether she thought they knew something she didn't, or it was simply her panic that inspired her to follow them, she couldn't say. But it wasn't something she was proud of, regardless of the circumstances. Tough as nails, Parker, but any one of us can lose it when faced with such things, so nobody looked at her any differently for that. Apparently, while running as quickly as she could, something either hit her or shocked her. Whatever it was, it knocked her out cold. When she awoke, she was exactly where I found her, with no memory of who had carved those numerous wounds into her flesh. Gray and Jackson were located not far from the cabin, maybe, 20 yards to the west of it. Given the fact that they had been consumed by the fire, it was assumed that they simply failed to deploy in time. When the pathologist found some trauma in the back of their heads that was not caused by the blaze, it would be taken for granted that whoever attacked Parker likely took them out of the equation as well. I can happily report that the rest of my crew made it through that wildfire with nothing more than some similar injuries to those I suffered. Second-degree burns, some bumps and bruises, scrapes and such. There were others out there that day who left those woods in much worse shape than us, but things could have been a lot worse, all things considered. I spent a lot of time at the hospital over those next few months giving support to Parker while she endured several painful procedures. To this day, there's still some residual scarring given how deeply those symbols were carved into her, but we never found out what any of them even represented. She and I both researched all sorts of foreign and even ancient dialects, but haven't turned up anything like those she still sees in the mirror. Be it from the extreme circumstances we endured that day or the subsequent months of sharing each other's company, we grew quite close over that time. And we're coming up on our 2nd anniversary soon. And that's something she makes sure I don't forget. Even though she took my last name, I still call her Parker. It just feels strange to call her anything else, even after everything. We moved out to a smaller town a couple of years back. She's still on the job, while I've taken a bit of a backseat to most of the action these days. I still get into the thick of it at times, plus some of the things I've seen as an EMT are almost as crazy as what brought my wife and I together. Those are stories for another time, though. We never got answers as to who abducted Parker in the middle of that wildfire, but I can't help but wonder sometimes if the fire somehow guided me to her. It's crazy, I know, but after so many years fighting against that monster, perhaps we had grown to respect each other to a certain extent. I think about it often, everything we endured that day. Maybe that's why I've invented such, creative explanations for how things went. Even though we survived that wildfire against all odds, I wake up in a cold sweat at times after hearing those footsteps draw closer in my dreams. Those are the sounds that stick with me far more so than the whooshing of the inferno around us. Whether they were a product of my mind in a quite literally heated situation, I suppose I'll never know, but I still wonder sometimes. If the fire did indeed lead me to that cabin that day, could it be that it also feared what was responsible for what happened to Parker? It has been said, after all, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.